Hello all, and the warmest of welcomes to the True Crime Enthusiast podcast, the regular dose from my North Wales spare room of those tales of true crime that you won't find commonly on other shows. Some you may never have come across, others you may think, oh, where the hell has he pulled that out of? But which are all true, and which I scour the UK and Ireland, occasionally the world also, to bring to you. Doing so is myself, Paul, the creator, host and true crime enthusiast of the show's title, my beloved feline cinnamon, one-eyed ratbag, Peaksy, the true crime enthusiast cat, is here with me always, having been missing from the previous episode. And we're completed by yourselves, the reason why me and the Mog do our thing and have so much passion still for doing so, the wonderful enthusiasts of the show. It is as fabulous as always having you joining me and Peaks, which I thank you kindly for doing so. And I hope that as you have, then it's for an episode that finds you and yours all good, all safe, and all well. This time around then, I bring a terrible and sad tale that I've had on the list for quite some time now, a couple of years actually. Where over a 4-day period back in the autumn of the year 2000, police in the West Midlands and Worcestershire were faced with a horrifying series of killings that they soon came to realise was the work of a spree killer, who if not stopped, would surely make that swing into serial moniker. One who possibly, as you'll see as the tale progresses, possibly already was one, in a tale which I shall bring to you right now. The episode contains details and descriptions of crimes and events, including descriptions of injury detail, including disturbing descriptions of injury detail that some listeners may find disturbing and or distressing, so discretion is advised whilst listening. The episode contains details and descriptions of crimes and events, including descriptions of addiction and disturbing descriptions of injury detail that some listeners may find disturbing and or distressing, so discretion is advised whilst listening in all. Bearing that in mind, please join the True Crime Enthusiasts for an episode I've entitled Bigfoot's 96 Hours of Carnage. I begin by taking you back to 1997 and with the story of a hard-hitting, award-winning TV documentary entitled Home Ground: The Trouble with Jodie. That was created by a journalist named Peter Wilson and that was aired on the BBC, who explains, butane gas was killing a child every week in the UK. It was more dangerous than heroin and ecstasy combined. Of children who tried it for the first time, 40% died instantly, usually in alleyways, but few people were taking much notice. Jodie Hyde was one such user. She'd begun her relationship with butane gas when she was 13 in 1992, and it had never really ended. Because I was always one for trying to be brave, she explained. And for the 5 years up to the documentary, had constantly carried a can hidden in her sleeve. Even when she went to sleep at night, she held the can up by her face. And not even the death of her best friend Samantha, after inhaling butane, could stop her. Her grandmother regularly removed bin liners full of cans from her bedroom. The documentary chronicled how the Hyde said it had turned Jodie into a monster. From the happy child with a sweet voice who loved to sing Eternal Flame to her loved ones, to by then an 18-year-old Jekyll and Hyde who begged, stole and lied to feed her addiction. At one point spending up to £15 a day on a 12 crate of butane gas, enough to keep an average cigarette smoker in filled lighters for about 6 years. Her family had even periodically felt they'd had to turn her out of their Birmingham home because there were younger children in the family, and Jodie could not simply live in the house without her can of butane. Her mother Tracy said at the time, "Jodie loves life. She's just a lovable young girl. She's helpful around the house. She'd do anything for anybody. But the Jodie on the gas is nasty and she can be violent. She'll put windows through. She threw a brick at me once. When she's normal, she wants help. But when you give it to her, she's so high, she doesn't want it. Unless I could tie her up, put bars on the windows and lock her in her bedroom, there's no way I can get her off the gas. I just can't physically do it." Jodie herself claimed to Peter Wilson that she felt guilty about the death of her best friend and hated her addiction, but said she couldn't come off butane, though she would periodically try. At one point, describing a period when she believed she'd come off the gas for good, Jodie said, "All shopkeepers care about is the money. As soon as I go in a shop, they know exactly what I want. All the shopkeepers know me, and they get it out from behind the counter. A pack of 12 cans. If I were a smoker, that would take me 6 years to get through, but they all know I'm sniffing it and I'll be back for more tomorrow. They're only interested in the money." She added, "I wish I could get through to people about the dangers of butane. I'm the lucky one. I'm alive. I've been in hospital so many times because of my breathing, but other people have died. I do get chest pains, and I do find it hard to breathe. It will take a long time to heal up, if it does heal up." The documentary The Trouble with Jodie went on to win several television awards, and the anti-solvents charity Resolve used it as part of its campaign to successfully change the law to make it illegal to sell gas to under 18s. In fact, Birmingham Trading Standards even gained a court victory in 1997 with successful prosecution of the shop owner who had sold Jodie crates of gas at inflated prices. However, it wasn't so positive for the Hyde family following the documentary. Jodie had left the family home, Tracy unable to let Jodie stay after she started openly sniffing the gas in front of her 3 younger brothers and baby sister. And for a time, she lived with her grandmother, though during filming of the documentary would disappear periodically on butane binges. Peter Wilson describes that he searched for Jodie during one such time and eventually found her a few weeks later begging on the streets of Balsall Heath, a suburb to the east of the city, with a can of butane gas jammed up the sleeve of her anorak. Though she didn't want to talk then, a few days later she phoned him up and invited him to see her at the flat of a new friend that she'd made. Whose children Jodie was helping to look after. Jodie told him happily that she was then off the gas, even waving her arms in the air to prove that she had no hidden cans of butane on her, and saying, "It's been 30 hours since I had some gas, and I haven't even had a craving for it. Usually, I get up and don't even have a wash. I go straight out to the local shop and buy loads of tins of gas. I've got a £5 in my pocket, but I still don't want the gas." Jodie had responded following this. She'd returned to her grandmother Margaret's and looked like an ordinary teenager again. There was talk of her wanting to go into schools and warn others of the dangers of solvent abuse, and even go back to college. She even for a time moved back in with Tracy and her siblings. And I wish I could tell you it was a happy ending for Jodie, but sadly, the new friend that she'd made was a registered heroin user and had soon introduced Jody to its use, with her soon becoming a registered addict herself. Soon, despite attempts at drug rehabilitation in a residential centre, she had fled there and had even left the sanctuary of both her family home and her grandmother Margaret's house, sofa surfing or even sleeping rough instead. Margaret explained later how heroin had truly gotten hold of Jody, saying sadly, "Last week she came round and stole my video and sold it for £30. The methadone program is not working. She just drinks her dose in the chemist and then looks for heroin. She's so thin I can hardly recognise her. And filthy. Jody was always so clean. Jody's still taking a can of gas with her wherever she goes as well." It was almost 4 years before Peter Wilson heard from Margaret Hyde again in November 2000. When he answered the message that had been left for him from Margaret, referenced Jody, he claimed later that before he even spoke to her, he was already expecting to hear the worst, to hear that Jody had died of an overdose. Feeling sad for the vulnerable girl he'd come to know and like, and ruin that, unlike so many who do so well to, heroin was one demon she just couldn't shake. He was, sadly, right, though only half right in his expectations. At 6:15 a.m. on the morning of November the 9th, 2000, 2 patrolling police officers passing an area of wasteland near the Ackers Trust, an adventure play area just off Golden Hillock Road in the Sparkbrook area of Birmingham, noticed the smouldering remains of a fire and got out to investigate. Though the fire had been burning for some 2 hours, they were able to make out the unrecognisable remains. They were able to make out the remains of a human body, later determined to have been trussed up with green rope in a grubby pink blanket. The fire had caused 60% burns to the victim, though identification was ultimately made possible from a single surviving fingerprint. The body was that of then 21-year-old Jody Hyde. A subsequent post-mortem concluded that she'd been strangled before her naked body was rolled up in a blanket and... Oh, fuck off, Di. The fire had caused 60% burns to the victim, though identification was ultimately made possible from a single surviving fingerprint. The body was that of then 21-year-old Jody Hyde. A subsequent post-mortem concluded that she'd been strangled before her naked body was rolled up in a blanket and set on fire, though there was no evidence of any sexual assault. As the investigation into Jody's murder began, spearheaded by Detective Superintendent Mel Shaw, it was established that Jody was a somewhat nomadic figure, as I've described, though a familiar one around the Handsworth and Digbeth areas of the city, and had last been seen the afternoon before, attending an appointment to collect a methadone prescription at Mark's Chemist on Soho Road in Handsworth. CCTV footage examined later showed Jody, distinct in her Nike baseball cap, getting into a lightish coloured vehicle on Soho Road, the last time that she was seen alive. 3 days later now, in the early morning of Remembrance Sunday, and 22 miles away to Rashwood near Droitwich, just off Junction 5 of the M5 motorway. That morning, just after 8:15 a.m, Paul Ryder, then landlord of the Robin Hood pub in Rashwood, decided to take his black Labrador for an early morning walk along the lane behind the pub, and as the dog meandered along the lane, Mr. Ryder spotted something ahead of him. He said later, "At first, I thought it was a Guy Fawkes or other mannequin, but I got right up close and realised it was a body. She was looking over her right shoulder. Her forearms were raised and her head was covered in blood. I could hardly see her face. Her best friend wouldn't have recognised her." As Paul ran back to the pub to call the police, disturbed at the discovery he'd just made, he spotted a pair of black shoes and a white top near the naked body. No other clothing was apparent. When police arrived a short time later, they could truly understand the horror that Paul felt, for the young woman, lying in a pool of blood, had been beaten, stamped upon, and kicked so ferociously that the pathologist called to the murder scene, Dr. Klaus Chen, could only just detect that she was white and female. The later post-mortem revealed that her face had been destroyed so badly that none of her features were visible. Bones were sticking out of gashes in her nose and cheek. Her jaw was later found to have been broken in 3 places and had become detached from her skull, and most of her teeth had been knocked out. Her brain had even become dislodged. There were deep gashes to her throat, later thought possibly that had been inflicted with a sharp-edged instrument, some type of bar. Her voice box had been crushed, and there was bruising and laceration to her genitalia, again thought to have been inflicted with a weapon, though the majority of the injuries had been caused by bodily blows. Dr. Chen said later, "There were injuries to the brain, a hemorrhage, that indicates that the brain inside the skull has been rocking and made contact with the inside of the skull or has become torn away, caused by repeated blows to the head. Possibly punches that are causing the head to move violently, or possibly from an instrument. The blows would have to have been of considerable force, stamps or kicks at least. I can't say how many blows, but certainly in double figures." Horror beyond belief, that, eh? Now, if this level of violence wasn't overkill enough, a clearly visible tyre mark on the arm of the young woman indicated that her killer had then driven over her body. It was only the soft ground that she lay on that had prevented her arm from being broken by the impact. I ask you, what type of evil and hatred is in a person to do that? You don't even want to imagine, do you? As forensic science officers arrived at the scene to begin their examinations, and going to a murder scene isn't an everyday occurrence, is it? Other members of the team were unbelievably dispatched to yet another murder scene, this time some 19 miles away, back in Birmingham. Not long after Paul had made his horrific discovery, at 8:50 a.m, a woman walking her dog in Bell Barn Road in Leebank had found the body of 39-year-old care worker Carol Jordan. The mother of 6 from Balsall Heath, who was just 5 feet tall, had been walking to work for an early morning shift at the care home that she worked at when she'd been struck down from behind by a car. It was later determined, from paint marks upon and the unusual vertical tears in her jeans, shattering her pelvis with the impact, before being dragged some distance and then battered to death, punched, kicked and stamped upon so hard that even Carol's liver had split in two. Pathologist Dr. Edmund Tapp later estimated that Carol's killer had rained at least a dozen blows down on her head, thought to have been with a brick or heavy stone, cracking her skull and shattering her jaw, saying, "In amongst the pools of blood, there appeared to be pieces of body tissue. She had been severely beaten or kicked when she was lying on the floor. What appeared to be fragments of brick or stone were found close to the body. It makes one think that an object such as this might have been used in addition to punches or kicks." Carol was only ultimately identified through dental records. There was no trace of blood from the impact point to where Carol's body was found, suggesting that clothing had been held against any wounds to stem the flow, though a bloodstain, a partial handprint, was found there, some distance from where Carol's body was found, a forensic science officer described later. It was as if someone had been bleeding heavily from the head or the face, lying on the pavement, and had stood up while they were still dripping blood, putting their hand down to steady themselves. Now, initially, all three murders were being treated by police as entirely separate, as there was nothing initially about them that suggested they'd been carried out by the same person, though what are the chances really of three separate killers committing similar horrendous acts of extreme violence within such a short time space and geographical location, I ask you? But ultimately, all three were linked, and a Holmes entry created, Operation Green, that was linked between the three incident rooms between West Mercia Police at Worcester and West Midlands Police at West Midlands Police Headquarters in Birmingham. Over the following 3 weeks, more than 100 police officers and 50 support staff from the West Midlands and West Mercia forces, under the overall command of Detective Superintendent Shaw, were to gather more than 100 separate exhibits, view hundreds of hours of CCTV footage, process some 3,000 plus documents, and interview more than 2,000 people, of which over 1,000 statements were taken. There was, however, to be such a multitude of forensic evidence discovered at the scenes of each of the murders that Martin Whitaker, the scientist who headed the Forensic Science Services team, said of it later. The team pulled together every strand of forensic evidence to create a kind of spider's web, and in the centre of it all was one man. In 20 years of working for the FSS, I have never had to deal with so much evidence in relation to one suspect. It was quite overwhelming. It was this evidence discovered which firmly led to all three murders being linked, which I shall come on to shortly. Though it was to take a couple of days, for identification was only made possible through fingerprinting and dental records when her teeth were discovered and her jaw pieced back together. The young woman discovered in Rashwood had been identified as 25-year-old Rosemary Corcoran, a mother of 3 who had lived in Ryegrass Walk in the Castle Vale area of Birmingham. Of Irish descent, Rosemary was a very well-liked person, and testimonies to her lovely character, personality and nature are far too numerous to mention. And testimonies to her lovely character, personality and nature are far too numerous to mention. As a slight aside, I even personally got testimony about Rosemary myself, as a couple of years back when I was originally researching this tale for the show. As I said, I've had it on the list for a few years now. For one reason or another, its time has only just come around now. A member of Rosemary's family reached out and was kind enough to talk to me about her. They know who they are, and for which they have my utter gratitude. Her death shocked all who knew her, as a former neighbour, Sheila Flanagan, described later. On the Sunday, my friend rang me up and said there was something going on at Rosie's. They were moving all the furniture out. I thought maybe she didn't want to live in Castle Vale anymore. Maybe she was moving off. On the Monday, a girl came up to me when I was out saying a Rosemary Bernadette Corcoran from Ryegrass Walk had been killed. We said, "It's not Rosie, she doesn't live there." So I went and knocked on the door. This lad came out. It was her uncle, and I asked him. He said, "I'm sorry, but she's been murdered." That's how I found out. Now, what initially linked the murders of Jodie and Rosemary for certain, and some sources claim Carol too, though I don't know as to the authenticity of this claim, but Jodie and Rosemary were regular customers of the Rainbow Public House on the junction of the High Street and Adderley Street in Digbeth. And inquiries revealed that Rosemary had been in there on the Saturday night, her first night out in 6 months, and the last time she'd been seen alive. However, before her body had been positively identified, on Monday the 13th of November at 4 p.m, police received a telephone call from a regular at the Rainbow Pub, a 35-year-old man named Philip Smith, that was to take the then fledgling investigation down a particular route. Detective Constable Ruth Wilkins later recalled Smith's phone call, saying, "He said he would like to come to the police station to help with the inquiry, and that he'd seen Corcoran on Saturday night leave the pub with an unknown man. He insisted he would like to come over to the police station. He said he'd been asked to contact the police by someone else and gave us his mobile number." Within an hour of this phone call, Smith had presented himself at Castle Vale Police Station, where he now gave a slightly different account. In his subsequent statement, Smith admitted to being at the Rainbow in company with Rosemary, her boyfriend, Mark Sultan, her aunt, Diane Russell, who was bar staff there, and another male friend, an old flame of Rosemary's, Martin McDonough, but claimed they were later separated when he, she, and Martin McDonough went to another late-night pub nearby, the Kerryman. Mark by now having gone home, and McDonough was ejected from the premises. Smith said that he and Rosemary then went to Monte Carlo's, a nightclub on Soho Road in Handsworth, where she'd paid for him to get in, and that when they left some time later, Rosemary was confronted by a man he described as a teddy boy, with whom she had argued at the Kerryman. Smith said that the man became aggressive, so he had asked Rosemary if she wanted to go home. Claiming that she told him she didn't, he said he then left her, adding that he had noticed, I quote, 2 black males hanging around whom he'd also seen earlier in Monte Carlo's. Worn out from a night on the town, he claimed he went home at around 5 a.m. and didn't rise until 3:30 p.m. later that day. He had concluded, "I've made this statement in the hope that the police will find Rosie safe and well." Now, this gave police a definite place to start, and so, upon examining the CCTV from outside Monte Carlo's on St. Michael's Road, there on screen for all to see was Philip Smith struggling with Rosemary Corcoran, easily identifiable from her 5'3" frame and dark shoulder-length hair, and his 6'4", 22-stone frame. The CCTV date and time code showed that the event had occurred at 4:40 a.m, just hours before Rosemary's body was found. So, if Smith wasn't her killer, he was certainly one of the last people who knew her to have seen her alive. 2 days after the discovery of her body then, at 7:15 p.m. on the evening of Tuesday, November the 14th. 2 days after the discovery of her body then, at 7:15 p.m. on the evening of Tuesday, November the 14th, Detective Sergeant Paul Connup and 3 of his colleagues, plus 2 uniformed officers, had arrested Philip Smith at his home, Flat 3, a first-floor flat at number 14 Braithwaite Road in Sparkbrook. At number 14 Braithwaite Road in Sparkbrook. When told he was being arrested on suspicion of the murder of Rosemary Corcoran. A fast-moving investigation this, and though all 3 cases were early on linked, as I said before, this was before they were. Smith had requested that he be allowed to put on footwear and had moved to do so, putting on a pair of steel toe-capped boots. Detective Sergeant Connup recalled later, "I took Mr. Smith into the hallway. As we were walking, I noticed the bathroom light was on. There was a large amount of clothing in the bath which appeared to be full of water. The water appeared to be a reddish-brown colour. At that point, Mr. Smith moved past me to turn the bathroom light off. He looked at me and raised his eyebrows. I found that to be significant." Just how significant was to be revealed later. Upon being taken to Worcester Police Station, during an interview with Detective Sergeant Andrew Price, Smith had largely given the same story as before, admitting the same movements and claiming that Rosemary had been drunk, had refused to go home with him, and so he had left her outside at around 4:40 a.m. Even further into his previous statement that the 2 black men who had been hanging around as he had driven away, Rosemary had been dirty dancing with earlier in the club. He had gotten home about 20 minutes later, having been driving. However, detectives countered this claim on 2 counts. They presented Smith with the CCTV footage of him violently manhandling Rosemary outside the club, and this was backed up with the accounts of 2 on-duty police officers who had spotted this and had intervened. Police constables Jonathan Richards and Martin Maynard had spotted the apparent row, but had drove off after Smith claimed that his missus was drunk and he was angry with her because she'd been dirty dancing with 2 men in the Monte Carlo. The police officers had duly allowed Smith to go on his way with Rosemary, who he was leading towards where his car was parked. Within an hour, she was dead. When this was presented to Smith, he denied killing Rosemary and said that he was simply trying to get her home before he had left her. In all subsequent interviews following this, he gave no comment responses. By this time, forensic science officers were examining Smith's squalid flat and had seized his car, a battered blue Volvo registration number CNR316Y, and had produced a multitude of evidence from both. More than 100 exhibits alone were removed from the vehicle. But key was the discoveries made in his bathroom. The reddish-brown water was found to contain a submerged number of items of clothing, including a pair of men's size 44 waist black jeans and a size 10 pair of black women's Wallace trousers. Analysis of the Wallace trousers eventually established that they had been worn by Rosemary Corcoran on the night she was killed, a link supported by a forensic examination which proved that semen extracted from the gusset of the garment belonged to Mark Sultan, Rosemary's boyfriend. Whilst examination of the jeans revealed that they were heavily bloodstained and of 2 different types. One set of staining was found to be the blood of Rosemary Corcoran, whilst the other matched the DNA profile of Carol Jordan. A red painted stick with a crisp packet attached to it, taped on both ends and which was thought to have been used to stir the clothing in the bath, was also found in the bathroom and also tested positive for blood staining, though to a much lesser extent. However, it was thought strongly, based upon further evidence that had been discovered from his flat and his car, plus an eyewitness account and CCTV footage discovered, that this bloodstaining had come from Jody Hyde. It's pretty bang on that, isn't it? But there was much more discovered, which I shall come on to. At a special sitting of Worcester magistrates on Saturday the 18th of November, Philip John Smith was remanded in custody, having the previous day been charged with the murder of Rosemary Corcoran, flanked by 4 police officers as he stood in the dock. No application for bail was made, reporting restrictions were not lifted, and he said nothing as he was remanded as a Category A prisoner to the high-security Wood Hill prison in Buckinghamshire. By this time, Rosemary's death had been linked firmly to the killing of Jody Hyde and Carol Jordan, which police interviewed Smith in connection with on the 28th of November, and to which he gave no comment answers during interview. Police charged him with their murders 2 days later on November the 30th. So, who was Philip John Smith, and did police have a spree killer on their hands? Philip John Smith was born at the City Maternity Hospital in Gloucester on the 10th of July 1965, the oldest of 2 sons and 3 daughters born to sawmill labourer Henry John Smith and his wife Rose. Smith's family had initially lived in the city's Midland Road, where they were at one time neighbours of Fred and Rose West. Not the kind of neighbours you'd want really, them are they? Before moving to Hales Road on the Coney Hill Council Estate in 1971. Smith attended Coney Hill Infants and Junior School before being transferred for a time to a special school for children, with learning difficulties. He left nearby Longford Senior School at age 14 with no qualifications to join his father's new employer, Billy Dancer's Fun Fair. When the Smith family's financial situation had deteriorated when Henry had been injured in a motoring accident, the family had gone cap in hand to Billy Dancer asking for casual work on his fun fair, and for the next 6 years, Smith had paid manual work at travelling fairs all over Worcestershire and Herefordshire, setting up the rides, litter picking, that type of thing. Billy Dancer, describing the family, recalled later, "I used to call them ragamuffins. They were all the same, very, very unpredictable. We didn't know what they could do, and they didn't keep themselves very clean. My wife Kay used to give them clothes that our kids had grown out of, and coppers to put in the slot machines. She was very kind. We had quite a relationship with them." Concerning Philip Smith, who he recalled was a petty thief who would rob money out of the slots with the use of a screwdriver, Dancer continued, and in a description very much of his generation, I quote, "Philip was quite introverted. He'd say nothing to anyone, but he'd sulk if you asked him to do anything. He'd walk away and sit on a bench in the park rather than do what you asked him, and you'd see him talking to himself. He was a big kid, tall, but his brain was very small. Once he reached 12 or 13, his brain never got any bigger. I used to put him with my son Billy on the dodgems. He was a big lad, useful, he could carry things, but my boys had to tell him what to do. You couldn't leave him because he had no brains. He wasn't all there, as they say. But apart from being a bit of a tea leaf, we had no trouble with him. He wasn't violent or anything. Smith ultimately grew into a giant, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing more than 22 stone, and by 1989 had met and was living with a woman named Sheila Tingle in Ross-on-Wye in Herefordshire, whom he'd met when she took her daughters from a previous relationship to Dancers Fair. A friend of Sheila's recalled, Smith was manning a stall where you threw darts at playing cards on the wall. 3 darts won a goldfish. They got chatting, she gave him her telephone number. Within weeks, he'd moved in with her. Now there's no outright suggestion of any sexual abuse, but there is of violence within the relationship, as the friend furthered that Sheila was to lose custody of her daughters because social workers feared for their safety after Smith had moved into the family home. It is likely that Sheila was somewhat of a troubled soul who had involvement with social services already, for when she gave birth to the couple's son in 1990, whom Smith named Elvis Aaron Presley Smith, the boy was taken straight into care at birth. Twin girls born to the couple in 1992 were also taken away from the maternity hospital and adopted. Following this, Smith and Sheila moved to Gloucester, living in bedsits and often even sleeping rough, but shortly after the birth of the twins, Smith left the family for good when the relationship became difficult. Sheila was, reportedly, 8 years later, suffering severe mental health problems, reclusive to the point where she would even refuse to leave the bedroom of her Hereford flat. The friend added, "Since he was arrested for murder, Sheila has said she feels lucky to be alive." After a spell in Cardiff, Smith drifted around the country and then spent a year in Ireland lodging with a travelling family who took pity on him while he was hitchhiking in County Westmeath. They allowed him to live rent-free in a spare caravan they had, while he contributed a portion of his unemployment benefit towards food. However, they ultimately asked Smith to leave when they became uncomfortable about sexual remarks he had made to young women in the family. His exact movements following this are unclear, though he was to claim that he'd worked out of season periodically as a farmhand, a labourer, and even as a security guard, shortly before Christmas 1999, the then homeless drifter moved to Birmingham. With no home and no regular employment, he found accommodation at the Trinity Centre in Birmingham's Camp Hill, which offered help to the homeless and support for people with alcohol issues. Before moving to Flat 3, number 14 Braithwaite Road in Sparkbrook, a first-floor property managed by a housing association. He became well known locally, a familiar figure that locals called Bigfoot because of his size, his dishevelled appearance, and his size 13 shoes, or Lala, as he was similar in size to one of the Teletubbies from the children's TV show, and was a regular patron of local businesses such as the Shamrock Cafe on Stratford Road and of the Rainbow Pub in Digbeth, where he was employed on a casual basis as an odd jobber and where he served as an unofficial taxi driver for drinkers. Throughout his life, Smith had received over 30 criminal convictions for minor offences, beginning in May 1984 when he was fined £100 for theft. His record also included handling stolen goods, burglary, criminal damage and driving without a licence, for which he'd been fined and received probation, community service and suspended sentences for. But there were no offences of violence to his name. Indeed, Those who came into contact with him called him scruffy, frequently unshaven, and smelly due to his neglect of personal hygiene, but Smith was considered a gentle giant by those he met. In an interview with the Birmingham Evening Mail newspaper, Jim Smith, proprietor of the Shamrock Cafe, said, "He was a gentle giant who we named Bigfoot because his boots always used to leave black marks on the floor. 99% of the time he had a dirty appearance and looked like he'd been working on a car." Had this gentle giant battered 3 women to death, disfiguring each beyond recognition, so violent had the attacks been. Had this gentle giant battered 3 women to death, disfiguring each beyond recognition, so violent had the attacks been. Philip Smith's trial for the murders of Jody Hyde, Rosemary Corcoran and Carol Jordan began at Leicester Crown Court before presiding Mrs. Justice Rafferty on the 3rd of July 2001, where he pleaded not guilty to the charges he faced. On the opening day of the trial, prosecuting counsel Timothy Raggett KC told the court there was powerful and compelling scientific evidence linking Smith to the killings, saying, "The prosecution suggests these killings were and could only have been the work of one individual. The idea that more than one person was responsible for these killings, I suggest, is frankly an absurdity. The Crown say that individual was Philip John Smith." Outlining the case, Mr. Raggett said that Jody Hyde was a vulnerable individual who had drug problems and who had been befriended by Smith in the Rainbow Pub in Digbeth. After taking her to a medical appointment in Birmingham, Mr. Raggett told the court that Miss Hyde was probably killed at Smith's flat before her naked body was trussed up in a blanket, then bundled into the back of Smith's Volvo car and driven to open land at Ackers Trust in Birmingham, where it was set alight. Mr. Raggett added, "Clearly, her killer has gone to great lengths to remove all trace of her, to mutilate her and leave her in such a way that the discovery of her identity would be impeded by a maximum degree. That killer was Philip Smith." The jury heard that 3 days later, Smith had beaten Rosemary Corcoran with such ferocity that she was left physically unrecognisable, saying, "He drove her to Droitwich, where the violence we've seen here became fatal. He beat her with such force he literally shattered her face. She was so badly mutilated that identification of her body was only possible through fingerprints and dental records, after her jaw was put back together and her teeth, some of which were found sporadically, were examined." He furthered that a passerby had spotted a man he had later identified as Smith filling a red petrol can up at the nearby Jet service station on the corner of Birmingham and Stourbridge Road at 6:05 a.m. Indeed, pensioner Harry Hadgkiss, an early riser who had headed there for his morning newspaper, had spotted a man he was to firmly identify in court as Smith doing so, noticing that he was unkempt and had blood on him. When Harry asked him what had happened, Smith had replied, "I've been in a fight." Mr. Raggett continued, "Following the pattern of Jody Hyde, this man went to the garage to buy petrol to set Rosie alight. He changed his mind for whatever reason. That man was Philip Smith." He added that whilst fleeing from the scene where he'd killed Rosemary, Mrs. Jordan had been knocked down by Smith as she walked to work, saying, "It was a serious accident and the police were bound to attend, so Carol Jordan had to die," and she did die. Fearing capture, Smith had battered Carol Jordan to death with a brick and a combination of kicks and stamps before fleeing. Now, the main crux of information found through researching this case, the account anyway, for it is the only one of the three with any witnesses that could give evidence so we can get a picture of what exactly happened, concerned Rosemary Corcoran's final movements, which the court was to hear about from a selection of witnesses. After Home Office pathologist Dr. Klaus Chen had told Leicester Crown Court of the mum of three's horrific injuries, as I described earlier, Diane Russell, her aunt, told the court that Smith was in the pub on Saturday, November the 11th, wearing a grubby black t-shirt with a skull motif on it, and, to be honest, and because of his size and build, you're not going to miss him really. That night, she, her niece, and her niece's boyfriend, Mark Sultan, were in there drinking, but by closing time, Mr. Sultan was fed up and had gone home, though Rosemary had refused to leave because she was chatting to her old flame, Martin McDonough. I thought she was going to have a few pints and come back to mine, Mr. Sultan had said in his statement. Mrs. Russell told the court how she left soon after herself, Mrs. Russell told the court how she herself left soon after and had gone to bed the worse for wear, saying, "That was the last time I saw Rosie alive." Drinker Patrick Savage had remembered Rosemary asking him where the nearest late-night bar was, to which he had suggested the Kerryman, and so unlicensed taxi driver Smith had been asked to take her and Mr. McDonough there. "He gave me a lift home and drove like a maniac," Mr. McDonough said in a statement read out by prosecutor Timothy Raggett. He said there were other people in the pub that wanted lifts. Steve Brunant, a doorman at the Kerryman, meanwhile, had remembered Smith, Rosemary and Mr. McDonough being there, as under cross-examination from Rachel Brand KC, defending Smith, Mr. Brunant had told the court that a drunk Martin McDonough had been hauled out of the ladies' toilets and ejected from the Kerryman. Later, at around 4:40 a.m, CCTV footage showed Smith manhandling Miss Corcoran outside the Monte Carlo Club in Soho Road in Handsworth, the row which PC Jonathan Richards and his colleague PC Martin Maynard had spotted and intervened in, though had left when Smith had assured them Rosemary was simply drunk and had been rowing, and they'd been rowing after she'd been dancing with a black man, as Smith claimed. Upon getting Rosemary into the car, it was alleged, Smith then drove Rosemary to Droitwich Spa in Worcestershire, bludgeoned her to death, then ran over her body. On Remembrance Sunday, Mrs. Russell had found out that her niece was missing and told the court that Smith reappeared in the pub that afternoon, somewhat agitated and unusually for him, having different clothes on, telling the court, "He was clean. He never used to look clean. He changed his clothes far and between, not often. The next day Smith came in again. I was telling him that Rosie has gone missing." He had almost immediately rung police, and within an hour, accompanied by Diane, had voluntarily made a statement to the police at Castle Vale Police Station, though he had told a different story to that he had said over the phone, Diane told the court. Now, he'd been arrested the following day, and by the time he was charged with Rosemary's murder on the 17th of November, forensic science officers working in his flat and out of his car had amassed a true wealth of forensic evidence that led to 2 further murder charges almost 2 weeks later, when the evidence had been processed. Forensic science officers were each in turn to give specialist testimony to the court as to the evidence discovered, which I am in no way skimming over here, but I shall bullet point as follows. Strong evidence, including DNA, had linked Smith to the murders of all 3 women. His blood-soaked jeans were found in a bath full of water, and the blood matched that of 2 of the victims, Rosemary Corcoran and Carol Jordan. A pair of ladies' trousers found at Smith's home, also in the bath, women's black size 10 Wallace trousers, which could be directly linked to Rosemary Corcoran through DNA. Blood matching Carol Jordan and Rosemary Corcoran found on a pair of steel toe-capped working boots belonging to Smith, boots he was wearing when arrested. A pink fibre found at Smith's home and in his car, which matched fibres from the blanket in which Jody Hyde's body was wrapped. A red plastic stick with taped ends and a crisp bag attached to it in the bathroom, with traces of Jody's blood on the end of it. A plastic Aldi carrier bag containing property belonging to Jody, including clothing, makeup, a prescription, a can of lighter fuel, and even her birth certificate were found in the garden of a house 2 doors down from number 14. A Nike baseball cap, identical to the one Jody was seen wearing when last spotted on CCTV, which had been found in the rear garden. In Smith's car, meanwhile, scientists had found Rosemary Corcoran's blood on the outside offside tyre and mud flap and the rear offside wing. Smears of blood found on the back of one of the front seat headrests that matched Jody Hyde. A partial DNA profile of Rosemary Corcoran recovered from an apparent finger mark in blood found on one of the back windows. Paint flakes found on Carol Jordan's trousers were found to match paint from Smith's Volvo. Analysis of the tyres on Smith's car had found several different makes of tyres on it, namely Dunlop, Southern and Goodyear. The tyre mark to Rosemary's arm was found to match perfectly the Southern tyre, which was fitted to the front offside wheel. Tyre marks found at the scene of Rosemary's murder matched each of those on Smith's Volvo. A broken indicator housing found in the boot of the Volvo matched perfectly a precise fit to a piece of broken orange indicator plastic lens that was found near to the body of Carol Jordan. I'd be pretty swayed, wouldn't you? In addition to this motherlode, after trawling through hundreds of hours of CCTV footage, detectives had uncovered the following. Jody Hyde seen with a large, well-built figure wearing a blue-coloured top with a small white area on the left side near the top and dark trousers, clothing Smith was known to regularly wear. On the afternoon she was last seen, getting into a car that matched Smith's down to the missing wheel trims, stickers and black wing mirrors. An almost identical car seen leaving Acker's Trust 2 hours before Jody's body was discovered, where a fire could also be seen in the background. The footage of Smith and Rosemary Corcoran, as we've heard, struggling outside the nightclub. Smith's Volvo making its way through Bromsgrove. Back towards Birmingham. For Smith's defence, it was simple. The size 10 trousers belonging to Rosemary Corcoran that had been found at his flat had been among a bag of clothes Smith had stolen from outside an Oxfam shop. Describing himself as smelly, he told the court, There are bags that are left outside shops that I pick up and take back to my flat at night time. Defence counsel Rachel Brand asked Smith if he'd formed any idea of how blood from Rosemary Corcoran and Carol Jordan had been found on his jeans, to which Smith replied, "The police may have tampered with it," or something like that. He then gave the same explanation when asked why there was blood from Rosemary and Carol on boots he was wearing on the night they were murdered and which he had been arrested in. Forensic Science Officer Samantha Cave had already told the court. The spatters and splashes of blood had occurred when the wearer was standing close to someone who was being beaten. The staining around the eyelets gave me the indication the shoes had been blood-stained and someone had attempted to clean the blood off. Smith had claimed the same referenced the blood staining in his car. Now, needless to say, all claims of tampering were strongly denied by police officers and forensic scientists alike. And when Rachel Brand asked if the car could have been tampered with, in storage, Martin Whitaker had replied, "On the leaves on the ground near her body, as well as on bushes and trees, were splashes of blood. Smith's Volvo was driven to Stoke Lane, where it was parked on the left of a gated entrance to a big house. The distribution of blood on the wall suggests Miss Corcoran was still upright when she was assaulted, causing the facial and head injuries. She was still at least partially clothed. The assault resulted in blood being sprayed onto the wall, and it may have been that the spatters of blood went onto the Volvo. Blood found on the back of the mud flap, muscle on the wheel, and tyre mark on her arm all suggest to me she may have been run over by a car when it was in reverse. The garage is very difficult to get into, and fresh blood introduced to the scene would have been apparent. That's what we are paid to notice. There was no sign of anything in the garage having been tampered with." On the 17th of July, the 11th day of the trial, and after one of the jurors had been discharged after claiming charity commitments and exam retakes would cause him to miss 3 days of the trial, to which Judge Rafferty was proper pissed off about and even advised him to seek legal representation before he saw her about it, Smith complained of feeling unwell with chest and eye pains while under cross-examination, and proceedings were briefly halted while he was treated for the symptoms of a panic attack. When Smith returned to the witness stand, he said that he wished to speak to his barrister. When Judge Rafferty told him that he must answer questions, Smith replied, "I want to change my plea. I'm fed up with this. I want to change my plea." Rachel Brand, approaching the bench, told the judge that Smith had indicated to her that he wanted the charges read to him again, so complying, as the clerk of the court did so, Smith answered guilty to each charge, prompting tears from some of the relatives of victims sitting in the public gallery. The jury foreperson was then asked to return a formal verdict on the charges following the admissions and direction from Mrs. Justice Rafferty. One account reported later that this complete U-turn on Smith's behalf had took place only after police had agreed to give back £400 that had been confiscated from his flat at the time of his arrest, money that the sweet-toothed monster had wanted to buy Mars bars in prison with. Money that the sweet-toothed monster had wanted to buy Mars bars with in prison. I don't know to the authenticity of that claim. That may just be sensationalism on the part of newspapers, but it was an account that I found through researching. Isn't that unbelievable if it's true? Sentencing him to life imprisonment, Mrs. Justice Rafferty told Smith, "You robbed 3 innocent ladies of their lives, I suspect that their families will suffer the more as they simply don't understand why you did. The brutality of these ladies' deaths, designed by you to evade discovery, showing the coldness with which you dispatched them, is appalling. You should clearly have faced up like a man at the overwhelming nature of the Crown's case against you, but you chose to put the victims' families through misery, which you compounded by this trial. There is no other sentence other than that I now pass on all 3 counts. You will go to prison for life. You will go to prison for life. Following the trial, Carol Jordan's brother James said, Smith said nothing as he was taken away to begin this sentence. Smith said nothing as he was taken away to begin 3 counts of life imprisonment. Following the trial, Carol Jordan's brother James Taylor said, The last 8 months have been a nightmare for all of us, especially Carol's husband and children. The hurt is now over, but never forgotten. We are all hoping that Philip Smith will never, and I mean never, be allowed into the outside world again. He's not a man, he's an animal, he really is. To go 11 days into the trial and then do this is really callous. As he walked away from the dock today, he had a smile on his face. Our sympathy goes out to the families of Jody and Rosemary. Like us, they have to try and pick up the pieces and start to rebuild their lives in peace. There's one thing I'd like to do now. I want to ask Smith, why Carol and how? Carol Jordan's husband, Anthony, who had been left to bring up their 6 children alone, sobbed, The man is evil. There was no sexual motive, no robbery. Only he can answer why he killed her and left my children without a mother and me without a wife. Julian Rising, Jody Hyde's uncle, also welcomed the verdict, adding, As the judge said, he should have pleaded guilty in December. He knew he'd done it. He's just a callous person and has showed no remorse. Jody's mother Tracy, meanwhile, said, Jody had problems which she was desperately trying to get help with. I should have gone out and found her on the streets, brought her back home and locked her in her bedroom to keep her away from those people out there and from that bloody can of gas. She was a lovely girl, and we don't know how we'll carry on without her. I'm always struck by the devastation that families feel from the actions of monsters such as Smith. It was later revealed that Smith was to remain caged for at least 35 years, as news of his prison term was broken by the probation service to Jim Taylor, the brother of Carol Jordan. Jim told the Sunday Mercury newspaper that he'd received a call from the service on behalf of the Home Office, telling him that Smith's tariff had been set at more than 35 years, meaning Smith will be more than 70 years old before he can even be considered for release. Mr. Taylor said, "This is really good news. It means that if Smith is ever released, he'll be a very old man and no longer be a danger to other women. I hope Smith's helpless position will now force him to confess to any other murders he's been linked to, and put other families out of their misery." For yes, as with all horrific cases of multiple killings, cold cases are subsequently looked over that the perpetrator may be culpable for, and Smith was no different. After Smith was jailed, West Midlands Police Chief Superintendent Ellie Baker, then head of West Midlands Crime Support Department, said that any motive had been difficult to assess because there were no real links between the murders. It was claimed the former fairground worker may have been seeking revenge for his failure in romantic liaisons with women, or, and reaching somewhat here, I thought, even trying to copy mass killer Fred West, his former neighbour in Gloucestershire, as Smith's sister Janet, who still lived there, said, "I know Philip knew Fred West because he told me so. It came out when West was arrested." Detective Chief Superintendent Baker added, "We will be looking at other murders spanning the country dating back over the last 15 to 20 years. Philip Smith is a killer, and it would be wrong for us to leave it at that. The fact that he murdered 3 women in such a short space of time shows he has the capability of being a mass killer. It could have been a frantic one-off attack, but there may well have been more attacks. At this stage, we don't want to say how many crimes we're looking into, but we have been in contact with other police forces. Certainly, from our interviews, we have no idea why he had done this. He has been seen by a criminal psychologist, and one of the things that came from that was that he found having relationships with females very difficult." It was reported that on the 25th of October 2001, senior detectives from at least 6 police forces met at Hindlip Hall, the headquarters of West Mercia Police, to discuss possible links between Smith and a number of unsolved murders across the length and breadth of the UK. The number of cases that Smith's name has been mentioned in connection with ranges from between 9 to up to as many as 40, some unsolved of which we've featured in the past on the show, some that we are yet to, far too many to list here. Detectives have reportedly interviewed Smith on at least 3 occasions during the near quarter of a century he has been serving his 3 life sentences, in the hope that he would confess to any other murders he had committed. But each time, he has always refused to answer their questions, and no further charges have to date ever been brought against him. He is, however, strongly suspected of having killed for a 4th time at least. Out of that joint meeting I mentioned came suspicions that Smith could have murdered Patricia Linnett, a barmaid cum cleaner who had worked at the Rainbow Pub, where Smith had previously been employed, and whose body was found on her bedroom floor in her flat at Maxstoke Street in Bordersley Green in Birmingham, just 14 days before Smith had strangled Jodie Hyde. Police broke into her property after relatives became concerned that she'd not been seen for a week. Mrs. Linnett's daughter, Anna, had said that she'd spoken with her mother on the phone on the 17th of October 2000. A neighbour had spotted Mrs. Linnett entering her flat carrying shopping on the same day. Her body was found on her bedroom floor 6 days later. Now, it was known that occasionally Smith would give Mrs. Linnett a lift home. On one occasion, he'd put his arm across her front door, barring her entry, and although she'd felt trapped and frightened, she had managed to gain entry and had reportedly subsequently reported this incident to her boss at the Rainbow, who had confronted Smith with this claim. And it though no action was taken, and it transpired that Smith was the last person to see Mrs. Linnett alive, having run her back home from the Rainbow. But he failed to fall under suspicion because the pathologist who carried out the post-mortem examination on Mrs. Linnett was unable to find a cause of death for her. And despite the inconclusive outcome of the autopsy, her body was released for burial in her hometown of Athlone in the Irish Republic. But those who knew Patricia never bought the death by natural causes line, however, for she was described as a woman being in rude health. Neighbour Karen Blakemore said, "Trish had lived here for about 4 years. She was a barmaid at the Rainbow and I also knew Philip Smith vaguely. I was shocked when she was found dead because she was always very healthy. Philip Smith was here on the day the police kicked in the door and found Trish dead on the floor in her bedroom. As far as I know, he just came here because he was the last person to see her alive. He was just standing outside, bold as brass, when the police went in. It is incredible to think he went on to murder 3 women so soon afterwards. June Taylor, then licensee of the Rainbow, was also present with Smith when officers broke into Patricia's home. She said, "He actually drove me there because I was concerned about her. As we stood there waiting for the police to force their way in, he said, 'Hope she's all right.'" And then, of course, Smith was arrested and charged with triple murder, and police alarm bells started to sound, the spidey senses beginning to tingle that Smith just might also have murdered Mrs. Linnett. On the 8th of March 2001 then, in a joint operation between West Midlands Police and the Irish Garda, Mrs. Linnett's body was exhumed from the County Westmeath Cemetery where she'd been laid to rest, and a second post-mortem examination was carried out in Ireland by the then state pathologist Dr. John Harbison. At the previous post-mortem, the pathologist had noticed bruising consistent with an assault or a fall, but had concluded that this could not have been the cause of death. Her larynx had not been fractured, and so they were able to conclude that she'd not been strangled. The Irish Times newspaper reported, following Smith's conviction for triple murder, "During the operation, Garda assisted the police, who were re-examining